Nobody knew the war was already over. Not the German soldiers standing in the marshes of Belarus. Not the generals studying their maps. Not even Hitler himself. They were preparing for another Soviet offensive. What they didn't know was that they were walking into the complete destruction of an entire army. And the most terrifying part, the force that would destroy them wasn't just Soviet tanks or artillery. It was something Hitler had underestimated for years. By the end of this story, you'll understand why one of the greatest military disasters in history began long before the first shot was fired. Before we begin, if you enjoy deeply researched World War II documentaries that reveal the stories history often leaves behind, take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us continue bringing these untold stories to life. Now, let's travel back to June 22, 1944. The marsh country east of Vitebsk breathed heat even before dawn. Mist hung low over the black rivers and the pine lines, and the ground, swollen by summer rain, held the smell of mud, engine oil, and rotting wood. Somewhere beyond the tree belt, artillery crews stood waiting in the half-light, cigarette embers blinking and dying in cupped hands. Horses shifted in German picket lines. Mosquitoes drifted over foxholes. In the Soviet rear, along roads that had been hidden under camouflage netting and forest shade, columns of men, guns, fuel, and trucks pressed forward in silence. Among the ammunition crates and bread sacks sat another kind of cargo, ordinary almost to the point of invisibility, rows of canned meat stamped in English, tins born in a democracy an ocean away. Nothing about that little metal can looked grand enough to help bury an empire. Yet before the summer was over, that humble object, multiplied by the millions, would seem to say more about the war's outcome than all the banners, speeches, and marble fantasies of the Third Reich. This moment mattered because it arrived at the hinge of the war. In the West, the Allied landings in Normandy had already begun to redraw the map of Europe. The world watched the beaches of France. But farther east, in the forests and shattered villages of Belarus, a second blow was gathering, larger in ground scale, more destructive in manpower, and aimed not merely at pushing German forces back, but at annihilating one of Hitler's great field commands outright. Stalin had promised at Tehran that the Soviet Union would launch a major offensive to support the opening of the Western Front. The offensive that emerged was Operation Bagration, named for the Russian general Pyotr Bagration, who had died fighting Napoleon in 1812. The name itself carried memory and revenge. By mid-1944, the Soviet state intended not only to strike back but to make Germany suffer a military catastrophe proportionate to what the Soviet Union had endured in 1941. Army Group Center stood in the path of that revenge. On paper it looked formidable. German field armies spread across a broad defensive arc, anchored on towns that Hitler had designated as strongpoints or fortified places. In German imagination, Belarus seemed defensible precisely because it was unpleasant. Its marshes, forests, poor roads, and river barriers all appeared to favor the defender. Veteran officers still believed that whatever had changed in the East, one thing had not: the German army, if properly handled, could stabilize a front, absorb a blow, and restore order through discipline and counterattack. Many expected the main Soviet summer offensive to fall farther south, in Ukraine, where previous operations had already built momentum. Soviet deception encouraged that belief. Reserves were kept away from the danger point. Army Group Center was left exposed to a storm it had not truly imagined. That contrast between expectation and reality was one of the cruelest features of the disaster. German soldiers in Belarus did not think they were standing on the lip of the abyss. They expected another hard campaign, certainly, another Soviet attack, another period of pressure and attrition. They expected to suffer, to retreat perhaps in sections, to improvise and endure. What they did not expect was operational erasure. They did not expect entire corps to vanish in encirclements, roads to dissolve under waves of armor and aircraft, headquarters to lose contact with divisions that no longer existed in any meaningful sense, or retreat itself to become a kind of hunted migration through swamp and flame. They did not expect the Soviet Union to move with such depth, coordination, and mechanical reach. Above all, They did not expect that the war was entering a phase in which German experience, courage, and stubbornness were no longer enough even to manage defeat. The offensive that came against them had been prepared with exceptional care. The Red Army massed on a front roughly 450 miles wide. Soviet forces assembled 166 divisions for the Belarusian operation. Maskirovka, camouflage, deception, false radio traffic, hidden concentrations, persuaded the German command that the decisive blow would fall elsewhere. Operational reserves were shifted south. Against Army Group Center, Soviet planners achieved overwhelming local superiority, including a vast edge in armor. One modern account estimates a 7-1 Soviet superiority in tanks and self-propelled guns in critical sectors. The offensive also came backed by lessons learned over years of bloodletting, better artillery preparation, more skillful coordination between fronts, improved engineer support, deeper exploitation doctrine, more experienced staffs, and air power used with increasing sophistication. This was not the Red Army of 1941 stumbling backward under shock. It was a war-forged machine. And yet even that description remains incomplete unless one follows the supply roads behind the front. Great offensives are not made only of courage, genius, or vengeance. They are made of axles, tires, bridging equipment, fuel drums, telephones, rails, flour, horseshoes, field kitchens, machine tools, radio batteries, and food tins that can survive mud, heat, and distance. By 1944, the Soviet Union had rebuilt astonishingly, but it was also benefiting from the industrial abundance of its allies, especially the United States. American Lend-Lease had delivered over 400,000 trucks and vehicles to the USSR during the war, while Soviet factories produced fewer than 200,000. The number mattered not as a slogan but as movement. The trucks gave armies reach. They pulled guns, carried engineers, moved fuel, accelerated encirclements, and helped transform tactical success into operational collapse. Nikita Khrushchev would later admit that the trucks and equipment received after Stalingrad enabled the Soviet mechanized offensives of 1944 and 1945, writing that without them Soviet losses would have been colossal, because there would have been no maneuverability. The little cans mattered too. Food formed roughly a quarter of Lend-Lease tonnage to the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev, with characteristic bluntness, later remarked that, without Spam, we should not have been able to feed our army. So while Hitler still imagined war as a contest of will, the coalition facing him had turned abundance itself into a weapon. Somewhere in the Soviet rear, a driver bounced forward in an American-made truck. Somewhere a Katyusha launcher sat mounted on an imported chassis. Somewhere a can opener bit into steel and a field ration became muscle, march, and momentum. There is something profoundly unromantic about that fact, which is why it is so revealing. Dictatorships prefer imagery of thunderbolts and destiny. Democracies often win by mastering the unimpressive miracles of repetition. One more truck, one more crate, one more meal, one more mile of repaired rail. In June 1944, the men of Army Group Center were about to discover that myth collides badly with inventory. The attack opened on the third anniversary of Barbarossa, the invasion that had once carried German columns deep into Soviet lands with breathtaking confidence. That choice of date was not accidental. Memory itself had been built into the operation. Before the main blows fell, Soviet reconnaissance and local attacks probed weak points. Then the artillery preparation began. Across sectors from Vitebsk to Bobruisk and toward Orsha and Mogilev, the line shook under barges whose purpose was not simply to kill, but to rip open command, communications, and nerve. The German front in Belarusia had been weakened by transfers, overextended by doctrine, and pinned by Hitler's insistence on holding towns that should have been evacuated in time. Once the Soviet breakthroughs came, the defensive geometry of the German position turned from asset to trap. Salients became pockets. Roads meant for reinforcement became roads of escape. Rivers that had seemed defensive allies became obstacles choking retreat. At Vitebsk, one of Hitler's fortified places, the logic of the regime appeared in its purest form. The town was to be held. Prestige overrode mobility. dogma overrode terrain. Withdrawal, even for survival, suggested weakness and was therefore treated as treachery to an ideological conception of war. But the battlefield did not care for ideology. Soviet attacks enveloped the position, and German units that might have escaped earlier were instead trapped and destroyed. To the south at Bobruisk, similar patterns emerged. Fronts were split, communications severed, an entire formation squeezed against the Berezina and other waterways under air attack and artillery fire. At Orsha, one of the key defensive anchors on the Moscow-Minsk highway, the Soviet breakthrough shattered another crucial sector. German formations, already under strength, were torn apart before coherent operational responses could form. In the early days, perhaps the scale of the disaster was still difficult even for the Germans themselves to grasp. Armies rarely recognized their own death in real time. They measured crisis in daily reports, in requests for reserves, in broken telephone lines, in staff officers insisting that the situation is serious but not yet irretrievable. Yet Operation Bagration moved too quickly for that language. Within 5 days, according to one summary, the Red Army had killed or captured tens of thousands of German soldiers. The offensive did not merely push the line back, it made a stable line increasingly impossible. Towns designated as pivots became cauldrons. Rear areas became front lines. What German commanders had once considered their strength, discipline, battlefield experience, the ability to hold under pressure, now only deepened the catastrophe when that discipline was chained to impossible orders. The human experience of that collapse was recorded most clearly by the men who stumbled west through it. Werner Haupt, a German veteran of the Eastern Front, described how the few regiments, often only at company strength, had to try to fight their way to the west through the extensive forest and marsh region. The Soviets pursued relentlessly, he wrote, overtaking columns, splitting them apart, destroying them piece by piece. Near Orsha, transport trains carrying wounded, weapons, and equipment escaped the encirclement only briefly before Soviet tanks overtook and destroyed them. Another German survivor recalled the retreat in language stripped of illusion, burning villages, guns and infantry fire, muffled explosions, and detonations mixed in with the thundering hurrahs. Whoever fell out because of wounds or illness experienced the horrible fate of the abandoned. Marshes, rivers, thick forests, the heat of the sun, hunger, and lack of water had a terrible effect. That is the voice of expectation breaking. No one speaks like that from inside a controllable setback. That is the language of an army ceasing to exist in organized form. There was another contrast too, one less visible but equally fatal. German doctrine still depended heavily on skilled local leadership, operational maneuver, and a timely commitment of reserves. But Hitler's command style had been draining the army of precisely those freedoms for years. By 1944, his no-retreat orders had become more than stubbornness. They had become a system for converting operational pressure into destruction. In Belarus, commanders requested permission to fall back to shorter or defensible lines. They recognized the danger. But recognition does not save an army when authority is concentrated in a political leader who mistakes immobility for strength. The result, as one account put it, was that the no-retreat policy was destroying armies a division at a time. Nobody could stop the disaster because the one man empowered to release those armies from the trap insisted on calling the trap a fortress. This is where the title finds its full meaning. Hitler's biggest military disaster was not simply a defeat in numbers. It was a defeat compounded by the paralysis of the system he had built. Soviet pressure alone would have been enough to create crisis. Combined with deception, partisan sabotage, air inferiority, logistical weakness, and command rigidity, it became annihilation. German intelligence had guessed wrong. German reserves stood wrong. German doctrine was strangled from above. German mobility lagged while Soviet mobility surged. And behind that surge, the deeper economic war was speaking. Armies that run on horses and improvised repairs do not fare well against enemies whose offensives are sustained by greater industrial depth, more fuel, more trucks, more bridging gear, and the plain, democratic vulgarity of endless canned food. As Soviet forces surged westward, the battle ceased to resemble conventional front warfare and began to resemble a collapse in layers. Encirclements multiplied. Columns clogged the roads. Air attacks turned retreat routes into charnel tracks of burnt vehicles, dead horses, splintered wagons, and men wandering in fragments of units that no longer had staffs, maps, or destinations. The road to Minsk became the graveyard of Army Group Center. By the time Soviet forces closed around the city, the Germans were trying not so much to hold ground as to avoid total encirclement. Another 100,000 German soldiers were killed or captured in the Minsk pocket, according to one widely cited summary. Prisoners were later paraded through Moscow, a bitter inversion of German triumphal expectations from 3 years earlier. The empire that had marched east promising a 1,000-year order was now feeding men into cauldrons at a rate too fast for propaganda to narrate. What made Bagration so devastating strategically was the completeness of the destruction. Army Group Center was not merely pushed back from a prepared line. It was gutted. One study notes that 28 of its 34 divisions were destroyed. Another concludes that a quarter of the German army's total strength in the east was eliminated in the campaign, losses from which it would never recover. Casualty figures vary depending on the method of counting, but the broad scale is clear. German losses ran into the hundreds of thousands, with estimates ranging roughly from 350,000 to 670,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Soviet losses were also immense, hundreds of thousands killed, missing, wounded, and otherwise lost to combat and exhaustion. Operation Bagration was no clean miracle. It was a grinder of men on a continental scale. But it ground one side's strategic spine beyond repair. And as the German front disintegrated, the moral landscape of the East returned with full force. The Red Army advancing through Belarus uncovered mass graves, burned settlements, razed farms, and the living evidence of Nazi occupation policy. Around 1 million civilians had been murdered in Belarus under German rule. Villages had been exterminated. Livestock and crops had been destroyed. Entire communities had been turned into ash and pits. This mattered not only as historical background but as emotional fuel. Soviet soldiers were not advancing through abstract terrain, they were marching through proof. Every charred village was an accusation. Every grave was a rebuttal to the ideological language that had justified the invasion in 1941. For German soldiers falling back through those same lands, that evidence formed a dark mirror. The war they had been told was civilizational now yielded smoking testimony about what that civilization had meant in practice. The transformation of perception happened in many registers at once. At the top, staff officers and generals understood that Army Group Center's destruction had cracked the Eastern Front open. In the ranks, men who had once believed that retreat could always be organized into another defense began to encounter a harsher truth. Sometimes a front does not bend, it liquefies. Sometimes a campaign does not produce a new line, only fewer survivors. Sometimes superior fieldcraft means nothing when operational scale, logistics, and political rigidity have already settled the outcome. Britannica would later summarize the psychological effect starkly. By the end of the campaign, only the most fanatical Nazi or self-polluted German could fail to recognize that the war was lost. That is not simply a strategic judgment. It is the obituary of belief. And still the offensive rolled. Soviet troops advanced at rates of up to 15 miles a day in sectors, liberating all of Belarus before the end of July and pushing onward toward Poland and Lithuania. The Vistula came into view. Berlin, though still distant, had entered the realm of military plausibility. That alone helps explain why Bagration deserves the name of disaster on a scale greater than popular memory often grants it. Stalingrad had shattered a German army and destroyed the myth of invincibility. Kursk had broken Germany's ability to seize the initiative in the east. But Bagration annihilated the center of the front at the very moment when the Western Allies were driving in from Normandy. It synchronized catastrophe. Germany could no longer hope that skillful transfer of reserves from one theater to the other would restore balance. There were too many emergencies and too little substance left with which to answer them. Somewhere in that rolling Soviet depth, the little metal tin remained. Opened in a forest, eaten beside a gun trail, tossed from the back of a truck, it was never the hero of the story. That was precisely the point. Great collapses are often explained afterward in the language of genius and blunder, and those things matter. Stalin and his commanders planned well. Hitler and his system performed disastrously. But between those polarities lay a third force, quieter and just as lethal: the ability of societies to sustain war through production, transport, and nutrition. Khrushchev later admitted not only that American trucks had given the Red Army maneuverability, but that, if the United States had not helped us, we would not have won the war, adding that the Soviets shouldn't boast that we vanquished the Germans all by ourselves. For a man formed by revolution and dictatorship to say that was to acknowledge something larger than aid. It was to admit that ideological certainty had been defeated, in part, by cooperative abundance. To the Germans on the receiving end, this abundance announced itself not in speeches but in sensations. It was the shock of Soviet artillery ammunition that did not seem to run out. The sudden appearance of fresh armor where maps suggested swamps and poor roads. The speed with which breaches widened. The persistence of attack after one defensive knot had been cut. The arrival of supplies behind Soviet spearheads quickly enough to keep momentum alive. The road dust of truck convoys. The dreadful realization that the enemy in front was not merely strong, but renewable. German soldiers had long been taught to despise democracies as decadent, divided, soft, incapable of sustained sacrifice. Yet in Belarusia they met the battlefield consequences of democratic industry, not softness, but scale, not decadence, but surplus converted into operational time. That encounter changed more than the map. It changed the meaning of the war for those still capable of seeing it clearly. There is a temptation, looking back, to treat Operation Bagration as inevitable. That temptation should be resisted. Nothing in war is automatic. The Soviet Union paid for its competence in 1944 with years of disaster, sacrifice, and learning. German collapse was made possible by specific choices, specific preparations, specific misreadings, and specific acts of endurance. The offensive succeeded because the Red Army had become able to coordinate mass and movement at an extraordinary level. It succeeded because Soviet deception was effective. It succeeded because Hitler misallocated reserves and clung to untenable positions. It succeeded because partisans disrupted German rail lines and rear communications. It succeeded because the Soviet command had learned how to turn tactical breakthroughs into operational destruction. And yes, it succeeded in part because the Soviet war machine in 1944 ran with material support far broader than the Nazi imagination had once considered politically sustainable among its enemies. Yet inevitability vanished for the men inside the event. For them there was only weather, noise, exhaustion, and the narrowing corridor to the west. One can almost follow a single German infantryman across those days, first confident that the sector will hold, then irritated by Soviet pressure, then unsettled by the loss of neighboring units, then alarmed by rumors of encirclement, then moving at night beneath burning horizons, then throwing away equipment to lighten the march, then seeing abandoned wounded by the roadside, then discovering that the rear is full of shellfire, then realizing the maps no longer correspond to any defensible line, then understanding at last that all the familiar measures of survival, discipline, obedience, endurance, are no longer guarantees of anything. He had expected a campaign. What he entered was a disintegration. And Hitler, far from the marshes, still believed in commands. That may be the bleakest irony in the whole story. The Third Reich had built itself on the promise that one will, one leader, one ideology could unify a nation into historic destiny. In Operation Bagration, that concentration of will became a mechanism of helplessness. The more centralized the authority, the harder it was to adapt. The more prestige attached to holding ground, the more costly every delay in retreat. The more ideology shaped military judgment, the less room remained for reality. Nobody could stop the disaster because the regime had arranged power so that the people who understood the battlefield could not overrule the man who no longer did. A dictatorship can appear efficient until the moment efficiency requires disagreement. Then it becomes a trap that no subordinate has permission to escape. The campaign also changed Soviet perception, though in a different way. The Red Army had begun the war fighting for physical survival. By the summer of 1944, it was fighting with the knowledge that victory had become operationally possible. That change in feeling mattered. Soviet soldiers moving through Belarus were not only avengers of invasion, they were now carriers of a continental reversal. They had seen German armies at Moscow, the Volga, and the Caucasus. Now they saw German armies dissolve in the forests of the West. The psychological vector of the war had turned fully around. That does not cleanse the Soviet system of its own brutalities, nor erase the tragedies that followed, including the fate of Warsaw. But it does explain the emotional power of Bagration in Soviet memory. It was revenge, liberation, and proof of transformation all at once. For the Western Allies, the operation was strategically invaluable. D-Day had opened the Second Front. Bagration ensured that Hitler could not answer it effectively. When armies die in Belarus, they cannot be sent to Normandy. When rail lines are broken and reserves consumed in the East, they do not materialize in the West. The liberation of France and the destruction of Army Group Center were not separate stories. They were converging pressures on a regime already stretched beyond repair. That is why Bagration deserves to stand beside Normandy in any understanding of 1944. One was the opening of a door in the West. The other was the smashing of the Central Wall in the East. Together they left Hitler's Europe structurally doomed. Still, the human memory of such disasters rarely rests on structure alone. It attaches itself to objects. A helmet in a bog. A burned wagon wheel. A road sign pointing to Minsk. A train line cut in the night. In this story, the recurring object is smaller and stranger, a can of Spam. It is an almost absurd emblem for the collapse of a world historical tyranny. But perhaps that absurdity is exactly right. Hitler promised grandeur, hierarchy, blood, destiny, and civilizational war. Against that, one part of the Allied answer was a lunch tin. Not a speech, not a banner, not a mythic symbol carved in stone. A lunch tin made on an assembly line, packed by workers, shipped across oceans, unloaded in Arctic ports and Persian corridors, hauled through mud, stacked in depots, opened by tired hands, eaten by men who would then march, drive, bridge, reload, and keep moving west. There is something morally revealing in that comparison. One system romanticized sacrifice and delivered mass graves. The other, for all its imperfections, proved able to transform ordinary labor and civic industry into sustaining power on a scale dictatorship could neither imitate nor comprehend. By August, the map had changed irreversibly. The Soviet Union had liberated Belarus. German positions in the east had been torn open. The road to the Vistula lay exposed. Army Group Center had ceased to exist as a coherent strategic instrument. And in the minds of many Germans who survived, the war itself had changed character. It was no longer a struggle for victory, nor even a struggle for a stable front. It was increasingly a race between collapse and denial. Some still clung to faith, as fanatics always do. But faith was now starved of evidence. In its place stood columns of prisoners, broken divisions, abandoned guns, and the bitter knowledge that this was happening not in some remote theater, but in the center of the Eastern War. If one listens closely to Bagration, one hears not only artillery, engines, and shouted orders, but the cracking of an ideological dream. National Socialism had promised that ruthless will could compensate for all else. It taught contempt for plural societies, for commerce, for compromise, for the patient, unglamorous work of free citizens producing more than dictatorships thought possible. But in the end, ideology met arithmetic. It met repair shops and rail schedules. It met oil refineries and bridge parks. It met truck tires, canned meat, and factories that did not have to conquer Europe in order to feed an army. It met, in other words, a different vision of power. Not perfect, Not innocent, but broader, deeper, and far harder to exhaust. That is why the story lingers. In the marsh dawn east of Vitebsk, with mosquitoes over the reeds and thunder building beyond the woods, the war was about to turn from resistance into reckoning. German soldiers expected another battle at the edge of endurance. What they met was a military disaster no one in Hitler's system could stop. They expected fortresses, they found cauldrons. They expected withdrawal and order, they found abandonment in swamp and fire. They expected, perhaps still dimly, that fanatic resolve could master events. Instead, they discovered that resolve is a poor defense against an enemy who has learned, adapted, remembered, and is being fed, literally and operationally, by a world larger than the one your propaganda allows you to imagine. And so the epilogue of Bagration does not belong only to generals or maps. It belongs to that small steel can glinting in the mud, open somewhere on the long road west. Inside it was meat, salt, calories, and time. Nothing transcendent. Nothing poetic. And yet poetry enters history precisely there, in the moment when the ordinary defeats the monstrous. Freedom often appears too soft for war until war reveals what freedom can assemble. Farms untouched by occupation, factories beyond the enemy's reach, workers who are not subjects, ships crossing oceans, allies sharing burdens, meals becoming momentum. In that sense, the can was more than rations. It was a quiet argument against tyranny. Hitler built his empire on hunger for land, for obedience, for racial dominion. The democracies and their allies answered, in part, with abundance. Not enough to spare the world from horror, but enough to ensure that horror would not rule forever. And in the smoke and marshes of Belarus in 1944, that larger truth began to sound unmistakably clear. An ideology can terrify millions, but it cannot outmarch the people who can still feed the road to freedom.